Hi, this is Pastor Jonathan, and I'm here with my cat Tatum. She's the expert that I have consulted on our subject today. You're watching the very first segment of Ask the Pastor, and you are invited to ask questions about God, the Bible, religion, etc. And I will do my best to try to answer those questions that you have. Last night I received a message asking the question, what happens when we die? Do we immediately go to be with God, or do we have to wait until the end of the age, the end of the world, when God makes all things new in order to be with God? And it's interesting because this is a fairly marginal subject in the New Testament. It's not really discussed a whole lot. In fact, I think that I can probably count on one hand the number of times that Jesus talks about life after death. And yet it's a pretty important subject. It's the question that each and every one of us have. What happens when we die? And so here we go. Let's begin to unpack that. So I've already mentioned that it's a fairly marginal subject in the New Testament. And one of the reasons that it's a marginal subject is because Jesus, along with the earliest Christians, in my opinion, believed that the world was going to come to an end within the first generation of Christianity. And so there was really no need to talk about life after death because they believed that Christ was going to return within their own lifetime. And really within some of the earliest documents of Christianity, the apostles began to address this issue. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, which scholars believe is either the earliest or second earliest document of the New Testament, Paul begins to address this issue because the Thessalonians have friends and loved ones who have died as they are waiting on the return of Christ. And so he gives them hope and encourages them in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 not to mourn as those who have no hope, but because Christ has died and conquered sin and death and risen from the dead, that we can have hope as well. So Jesus was often in opposition with the Pharisees, this religious sect in the New Testament. But on this issue, Jesus was actually on the same page as the Pharisees. What really distinguishes the Pharisees from the Sadducees is that the Sadducees, they did not believe in life after death. They didn't believe in what we call the immortality of the soul, or that some kind of immaterial part of who we are continues to exist after death. They did not believe in the resurrection of the body. The Sadducees believed that when we die, that's the end. We just go to the grave and hopefully we had a good life. The Pharisees, they believed that at the end of time there would be this resurrection from the dead. And this is a pretty historic Jewish idea. It's rooted in the prophets. We find this in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, when it talks about the resurrection of the just and the unjust, and God will judge everyone according to their works. And we see the same theme again at the end of the book of Revelation. Jesus is on board with this idea. In fact, when we read through the Gospels, we find Jesus referring to this event on multiple occasions. One really good example is actually when the Sadducees approach Jesus and they try to trap him. They try to ask a question to trick Jesus. And they ask Jesus about what Hebrew people called the Levirate law. And in Judaism, if a man died, then his wife would be inherited, would be a part of his family's inheritance. It's a very strange idea. It's based in very primitive ideas that women were property. And so she would be a part of his inheritance. She would go to his brother, and his brother would be kind of like a surrogate father. It doesn't really make sense in modern times, but the brother would bear a child on behalf of the deceased man, and that way his line would continue, because having children, um, patriarchy was just a really important part of Hebrew culture. And so the brother would marry his brother's widow and have a child together, and this was called the Levirate law. We find it in the Hebrew Bible. And so the Sadducees, they come up to Jesus and they say, Jesus, answer this question for us. There's this man who married a woman, and they didn't have any children together, and he died. And so she married his brother, and that guy died. And then she married the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. And of course, we know that it's this hypothetical question. And in the end, they say, well, she married 7 of the brothers, so in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And so Jesus proceeds to answer the question. The Sadducees, they believe that they've stumped Jesus by asking this question, but Jesus answers it by explaining that in the resurrection, that there won't be procreation in the resurrection. There won't be a need for marriage in the resurrection, because we won't be procreating. We won't need to do that. And so Jesus believed in the resurrection of the dead at the end of the age, and he alludes to this throughout the Gospels many times. I said that Jesus talks about life after death. I can count it really on one hand. And in my opinion, there's really only one clear passage in the entire, all the Gospels, where Jesus talks about life after death. And that's actually when Jesus is on the cross. The thief looks to him and says, when you enter into your kingdom, please remember me. And Jesus responds, today you will be with me in paradise. And this is, in my opinion, the only clear place in the Gospels where Jesus talks about life after death. John chapter 14, when Jesus talks about going to prepare a place, I think that that's actually a complex passage of Scripture that scholars are quite divided on. So even if that does fall into the category of talking about life after death, there are maybe 2 passages in all of the Gospels where Jesus talks about what happens immediately after we die. And so Jesus makes it pretty clear that when we die, we go to paradise. We go to this place where it was understood that there would be no suffering. We'd be with God. However, there are other voices in the New Testament. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul, who was a Pharisee, so he also believes in the resurrection at the end of the age, Paul talks about what happens immediately after we die as well in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And he makes the statement, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And so here Paul puts forth this idea that when our body ceases to function, that our spirit, or what I think of as our consciousness, continues to exist in the presence of God. And that is life after death. The New Testament focuses a lot more on what happens after that. What my favorite theologian, N.T. Wright, calls life after death. And so in other words, the New Testament isn't really all that interested in our own personal individual fate. It does give us the assurance that when we die, we go to be in the presence of God. But the New Testament also gives us the impression that being in heaven as a disembodied spirit is a temporary, intermediate kind of state rather than a permanent, eternal state. What will happen is at some undisclosed time in the future when Christ returns, our spirit, our consciousness, the immaterial part of who we are, will be reunited with our body. Jesus is quite clear about this throughout the Gospels. Once again, in his refutation of the Sadducees, Jesus reinforces his belief in the resurrection of the body at the end of the age. If you really want to have a clear understanding of this teaching in the New Testament, read 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul's argument is that just as Christ was raised from the dead, so we will be raised from the dead. And it gets a little bit tricky because Jesus' resurrection, according to Paul, was not just the physical resuscitation of his physical body. Jesus' body was raised from the dead, but it also went through this transformation. It became a glorified, eternal body. And Paul says that's the kind of body that we will have in the eternal state. That our physical bodies will be raised from the dead and will be transformed into the likeness of Christ, so that we will have an eternal body. So it's kind of hard for us to wrap our minds around the idea that our physical body will be resurrected, but transformed into some kind of spiritual body. But that's what the New Testament teaches. That is a very thorough teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Some of us might be asking the question, well, why? Why does that matter? Why can't we just be in heaven, in spirit? Why do we need our bodies? And that is a great question. It's a really important question. And we have to think like Jesus and we have to think like Paul, who were both first century Jews. In more recent times, humans have kind of seen the physical world in a more negative light. But Jesus and Paul, they saw the physical created world in a very positive way. It's rooted in their understanding of creation, that God created all things. God created all things to be good. And so the created order is good. God intended it to be good. We have made some poor choices. We live in a world that is broken. We live in a world that is filled with evil in various forms that have corrupted God's good creation. And so when Christ returns and our physical bodies are resurrected, it's a part of God redeeming all of creation, redeeming the whole created order, not just our bodies, but there will be this new heaven and this new earth, this renewed, transformed earth. And the way that I think of it is, just as our bodies experience this transformation, so does all of the created order. And God created our bodies to be good, and so God will redeem our bodies. And this really keeps getting deeper and deeper. When we look at Paul's teachings in the New Testament, he says in various places that salvation in this present life is the renewing of our mind. That salvation is about transforming who we are as a person in terms of the way that we think and the way that we feel and the way that we act. And in the same passage where Paul talks about to to be absent from the body is to be present from the Lord, he explains that outwardly our physical bodies are wasting away, but daily we are being renewed inwardly. And so Paul is telling us something that we know about all too well. And he's saying that our physical bodies are failing us. And each and every day we wake up with some kind of a new ache or new ailment. And at some point in the future, our bodies will fail us completely, that we will die. And that's when he says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And so salvation in this life is the renewal of our mind, the transformation of our mind. But salvation continues to the end of time. It continues to God's restoration of all things, making all things new, heaven, earth, and even all that we are. And so in the resurrection, at the end of the age, God will reunite our spirit, our renewed mind that God is shaping and transforming in this life with a new and resurrected body, so that we are a totally new, complete, composite being. And that is the New Testament's teaching on what happens when we die. And so the simple answer to your question is yes, when we die, we go to be with God. But yes, at the end of time, there will be this resurrection when our spirit and our bodies will be reunited. And in contrary to popular belief, the last book of the Bible, Revelation, tells us that instead of living forever in heaven, that we will live forever on earth in this new creation, this new Jerusalem. And the author of Revelation says that God will join us on earth. And so we will be a new creation, body and mind and spirit, and we will be living in a new created world. And the New Testament tells us that is the eternal state. And so it's not just this one step. There are multiple steps in this lengthy process of God making all things new. I hope that this was clear. I hope that this made sense. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this is not a simple explanation. There's a lot to unpack, and I hope this was helpful and beneficial to you. Until next time, take care and God bless.